It's those zombie voices again, the ones who rise up from the dead or from a corner to start the drumbeat of fear about debt and deficits, all in order to block progress for the people. So today is your antidote of information to undermine the cries about a phony debt crisis. This is Jonathan Tasini, and thanks for tuning in to our show for March 17th, 2021. Hey, take this time to become part of the community for the show by signing up at YouTube and as well subscribing to my newsletter at Substack. Just look over there for Working Life and you will find it all. That helps us build a community and helps us spread the word. And of course, if you'd like to become a sponsor of the show, go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab and click over there and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter of this network. Or you can do the same thing by using ActBlue. Go over to ActBlue, look for Working Life with Jonathan Tasini, and there you can become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. I wanted to riff on this topic today, and I will probably come back to it a lot over the months ahead. You are going to hear more of the drumbeat about deficits and debt, meaning, oh my God, we can't spend more money during the crisis because of the federal debt or the bigger deficits. So the top line idea here is there is no debt or deficit crisis. We have plenty of money in the richest nation in human history. This is nothing new. I wrote a whole book long ago about the phony debt crisis called It's Not Raining, They're Peeing on Us, which, by the way, you can download the 2013 updated version for free at workinglife.org. And the arguments there and the evidence are still relevant today, alas. Now, this is important to spread to everyone you know because even folks who are all in favor of progressive policies get rattled by the chorus of, we should balance the government budget just like we do with our own checkbooks. But see, that's nonsense. The U.S. Treasury can print money, plenty of it, and the Federal Reserve creates money through various tools it has. Now, as far as I know, none of my audience can print money, and if you do, you probably need a damn good lawyer. The point is that this analogy is just bullshit. And it's just rhetoric to confuse people. And here's the other point. In one way, our taking on debt is similar to the government taking on debt if we are doing so asking the simple question. Are we taking on debt for the right reasons? Now, if you take on debt so you can go gamble in Las Vegas, well, you might want to rethink that strategy. But if you take on debt to, say, put a kid through college, that's a good use of creating debt. The same is true with the government. Spending trillions of dollars now to support people in the greatest health crisis and economic collapse in a century is a great use of money. And then fixing the country's infrastructure and taking on climate change at the same time is a very, very good use of lots of money and a good reason to take on more debt as a nation. Now, a quick pause to make two definitions clear because sometimes they are muddled together, especially by dumbass politicians. When we speak about government fiscal deficits, we are talking about the annual budget of the government in a given year, say 2021. The debt is the accumulated deficits over many years. So to make this clear, you might have a huge one-year deficit that is hardly a blip in the total long-term debt over a period of, say, 20 or 30 years. Now, in 1946, the country's debt to gross domestic product ratio was 108%. And we use that measurement, debt to gross domestic product ratio, because it makes sense. You want to know what the debt is relative to how much economic activity there is. Now, if you look at this chart to your right in the screen, and for my audio listeners who should really subscribe to our YouTube channel to get a real good view of this, this is a chart by the Federal Reserve Board showing the debt to gross domestic product from the 1960s to now. The debt level after World War II was greater than, say, the debt level in 2010, as the country was dealing with the financial crisis depression, and it stood at that time at just 87%. In other words, the adults living right after World War II were handed the greatest debt the country had ever had, more than a debt assumed in the huge 2009 financial crisis. But that generation experienced the greatest prosperity in the country's history for many reasons, and probably the greatest prosperity in the history of humankind. Now, why was that? Now, yes, a big part of that leftover debt was because of the financing of World War II, but it was also partly that down the road, the prosperity came from accumulating debt to use for things like the GI Bill, to allow millions of veterans to go to school, and to building infrastructure. The entire interstate highway system was built in the 1950s, and a lot of that was built and financed by taking on more debt. In other words, stuff that helped people. In the third quarter of 2020, to rush ahead now to our current time, in the middle of the once-in-a-century pandemic and economic collapse, yes, the debt to GDP ratio rose to 137%. And that was smart. It meant that we kept millions of people from going bankrupt. And that percent will no doubt get higher with the passage of the $1.9 trillion relief bill that just passed. But we should not stop there. We need to spend more now with interest rates at rock bottom lows. Rebuild the roads, bridges, highways, and other systems with 100% climate change friendly projects. Forgive all student debt. All of that will be money well spent to get people back to work and save the planet, and really, over the next 20 to 30 years, support huge economic prosperity. Just think about this if people did not have to be burdened by huge student debt, for example. Now, if you want to wring your hands about the bigger government deficit or the debt, don't go pointing the finger at those people who want to spend money on the people. Point your fingers at those who prop up a corrupt system, because that's really at heart the problem of where our money goes. Point your finger at those people who give huge tax cuts to rich people and corporations. Point your finger at the billionaires who refuse to pay their fair share in taxes. Point your finger at those who vote for endless wars and escalating budgets for the Pentagon. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars, for example, alone have cost well over $4 trillion. Point your finger at those politicians who stand in the way of Medicare for all because they pocket huge contributions from the corrupt healthcare and big pharma industries, because Medicare for all would save the country, save the federal budget, trillions of dollars over the coming decades. Point a finger at the corrupt financial system, which is a floating casino, a Ponzi scheme, and fool's gold paradise, patched together by lies, deceit, and a healthy dose of massive public indoctrination of the wonders of the free market, because all of that triggers huge financial crises time and time again that are bandaged over by our tax dollars and then our debt. There are 4 easy ways to bring in more money to pay down some debt if that's someone's concern. Stop funding immoral wars. Force the rich to pay their fair share in taxes. Force Wall Street to pay its fair share in taxes. And enact Medicare for all. That would solve any debt issues that people would have and bring in trillions and trillions of dollars. But don't let the lie spread that we should sacrifice people's needs on the altar of a non-existent, a phony cry of debt and deficit hand-wringing. Okay, so now to my guests. Even though it's early 2021, I will sprinkle through the upcoming shows throughout this year progressive folks who are running for office in 2022. Got to get them airtime right as early as possible. So Shervin Azami is a strong progressive. He was born in Bologna, Italy, the son of two Iranian asylum seekers who faced religious prosecution after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. His family then immigrated to the San Fernando Valley and they settled in Canoga Park, California. Folks know where that is. And Shervin, a longtime community activist, is now running for the Democratic nomination for the 30th Congressional District in California, which runs roughly through the western San Fernando Valley and into the eastern Simi Hills of Ventura County. That's a lot of geography to cover. He's trying to take down a longtime corporate Democrat, Brad Sherman, and he joins me now. So you seem like a really nice guy, and you have great policy positions on your website. So what possessed you to run for Congress?
Oh, that's a great question. The fact of the matter is, our representative has been in office for over 2 decades. And we think about the primary issues in our communities. The number one issue is lack of affordable housing and our crisis of unhoused community members. We have 5 unhoused neighbors die per day in Los Angeles. More unhoused folks die of hypothermia in Los Angeles than in New York City and San Francisco combined. In sunny LA, we have more folks die of hypothermia. And our congressman, Brad Sherman, is literally in a position to do something about it. Why do I say that? Because he chairs the Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets Subcommittee on Financial Services. And that subcommittee has jurisdiction over our federal housing finance laws, over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and over authorizing new affordable housing programs. And as soon as he became chair, BlackRock and Blackstone, the private equity and asset management firms that have been exacerbating our housing crisis nationwide, started bankrolling his campaign. 98% of his campaign contributions come from corporations, lobbyists, and business executives, from weapons manufacturers, commercial banks, private equity firms, credit card companies. He occupies our seat in Congress on behalf of corporations, not on behalf of working people. And here in LA, we have massive wealth inequality. We have massive cost of living. Over 5 years ago, the city implemented a $15 minimum wage that just kicked in this past year. But because the median rent in LA is so high, in order to avoid paying over 30% of your income to rent, you'd have to be making $38 an hour, 2.5 times the minimum wage. That's leaving frontline workers behind. That's leaving essential workers behind. Our grocery store workers, our union workers, our sanitation workers. Those folks are not getting the basic necessities that we need. And I have never
I do want to talk more about the incumbent and actually some of the issues, but I actually just want to go back to the beginning of my question. Why you? What made you decide I'm the guy?
Our community lacks leadership. And I've always been fighting for social justice through the lens of public health. Before deciding to run, I was a legislative director for a national indigenous healthcare nonprofit in Washington, D.C., fighting to make sure the federal government honored its treaty obligation to tribal nations. And last year, as you can imagine, our number one focus was on COVID-19, something that disproportionately impacts Native communities with significantly higher death rates, hospitalization rates, and infection rates. And last year, we were able to secure over $4 billion as part of the stimulus packages in direct funding for tribal governments through our advocacy. That was the first time the federal government ever provided direct funding to tribes during a public health crisis, during a pandemic. Back during H1N1, the administration sent body bags as opposed to vaccines and testing kits. So I'm very proud of what we achieved, but it's nowhere close to being enough. We were also able to get passage of legislation that eliminated copays and deductibles for Native American veterans, guaranteed long-term funding for community health centers and diabetes prevention programs. But these are all incremental changes. We need structural reforms to deliver for working people in our communities. Yes, question?
So my question again was, that's a great recitation of the challenges that are in the community, but I'm asking about you personally. Did you think at the time that you were obviously weighing this, that you were the best candidate to take on Sherman? Were there other calculations of potential other people? Did folks get in a room and kind of toss it around? I'm trying to get inside your thinking about, hey, I'm the guy, I can take this guy down, putting aside his deficiencies. We're going to come to that a little bit more. But why you?
Because of the policies that we're running on, because of what I'm fighting for. When I speak to our community members and tell them that we're fighting to ensure you have a floor to stand on, we're fighting to ensure that you get the structural reforms you need to live a life with dignity, to ensure your basic necessities are met, from housing to healthcare to education, everything in between, that message resonates. And I hear people get excited about our message and what we're fighting to do collaboratively on behalf of our communities. That's what keeps me going every single day, is recognizing we need leadership and we don't have other options for folks that are stepping in and providing that leadership. So we need to take ownership of it and step in and provide that service for our communities. Be that voice that elevates the voices of folks on the margins, people who the incumbent has not represented ever in his tenure in office. And we are stepping in. I am stepping in as the candidate because I've been doing this work my entire life. And I want to deliver it now for my own community.
That's essentially what I was getting at, is that you've been doing this your entire life and you've not run for public office before. Do you think that you've got the kind of skills? And what I mean by that is you're obviously extremely smart and you're really passionate, but campaigning, being a candidate is a different kind of thing. You've got to connect with people. In theory, in the old days, you had to walk the streets, maybe not only because of the pandemic, but in the district you're running in, it's probably pretty widespread. It's given that it's the Los Angeles area, everybody drives. But my point is, someone who has to campaign has to have a particular set of skills that goes way beyond being right on the issues. And so my question was, what background that you have prepares you for that kind of work?
So coming from a background both in organizing and public health advocacy at the national level, we've been kind of building that infrastructure internally. I've been blessed by having access to some amazing organizers in our community that have been doing this work for a long time, that are really galvanized by our message. And we're working together to build a new political coalition here in our communities. A political coalition of young voters, Latinx voters, Black voters, communities of color, immigrant communities whose voices have been shut out. We are bringing them all together and creating our new political coalition dedicated to achieving the structural reforms that we deserve. And so whether it's having small Zoom calls with 3 or 4 people at a time, having driveway discussions that are COVID safe, or even thus far, we've been able to do voter registration drives in our community in person and meet people where they are at and talk about the issues that matter to them and grow it organically from there. And it's been very successful. And I see how energized folks are and how ready they are for change, for new leadership that's going to elevate their voices. And that keeps driving us each and every single day. And it keeps going stronger each and every single day.
Now, your issues on your website are completely progressive. You're certainly a big advocate for Medicare for all. You talk about the need for racial justice, about economic justice. I picked out a couple of things that I wanted to touch on, and these are all connected because it really is about priorities, money, inequality. And you had a long recitation about foreign policy, which often isn't talked about. And in particular, Brad Sherman, and I knew this going back, which was one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on the show. Brad Sherman has been a right-wing Democrat, a very conservative Democrat. He voted, as you point out, both for the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. He opposed the Obama administration's deal with Iran, which you can be somewhat critical of it, but at the very least, it attempted to create an opening and some understanding with Iran so that there wouldn't be war and people would not lose their lives, certainly in Iran and in the Middle East. And you go through a number of other issues that Sherman has been terrible on when it comes to foreign policy, and the fact that he is bankrolled largely by many defense contractors, who are proliferate, as you well know, in that area. So that's a really interesting focus. And I wondered whether you think that that has resonance among just average voters.
It absolutely does. There's a reason why Brad Sherman is focused on foreign policy. Our community is incredibly diverse. Roughly 1 in 5 folks here in our district are foreign born. And so there's a great emphasis on what we're doing abroad. And as we've talked about, Brad Sherman is one of those members of Congress that is completely for propping up our military industrial complex and voting for endless wars across the world. I think that we need to step back and eliminate our position of American imperialism and colonization abroad. And that still continues to this day through our financing of weapons manufacturers and our defense budget at a bloated $740 billion. Over half of our annual discretionary budget is geared towards the military. A fraction of that is for housing. A fraction of that is for education, transportation, and everything in between. And to think about our community, as an Iranian American, Los Angeles is home to the largest diaspora of Iranians in the United States. It's lovingly referred to as Tehrangeles. And as you mentioned, to think that our representative here still touts the fact, to this day, still touts the fact that he was one of 19 Democrats to vote against the Iran deal and wants regime change where the American government is dictating what that regime change looks like, as opposed to going through a route of diplomacy, human rights, and empowering the Iranian people to take control of their own government. Brad Sherman was the only Democrat to speak at a rally hosted by the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq. The MEK are an Iranian separatist group that were designated as a terrorist organization until 2012, until they started paying very handsome speaking fees to both Democrats and Republicans, and that helped initiate them being taken off that terrorist organization list. He spoke at their rally in 2019 alongside folks like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and Rudy Giuliani, the only Democrat to be there. And I think about the fact that the MEK was responsible for so many assassinations and bombings during the Iran-Iraq War, things that my family remembers, the pain and terror they remember. And to think that our representative here is someone who's trying to prop them up and continue the endless pattern of American imperialism abroad to oust the regime and replace another one that the Iranian people do not want, and that was a rebel group that was fighting against human rights for so long. To think that that's what he supports is an abomination, in my opinion, and in the eyes of so many of our community members. People want change, and Brad Sherman will never deliver that.
And I want to make the connection then between the point that you started with about houselessness and the funding for that, and the fact that we spend this huge amount of money on the Pentagon. These are all connected, which is why we often talk about them as one seamless thread. The reason we don't have Medicare for all is because there are people like Brad Sherman who would rather vote for money for the Pentagon, and you go down the list. So my point really is that, and I assume you agree with this is the richest nation in human history.
Absolutely.
And we have plenty of money if it's a question of priorities, not about money, right?
Budgets reflect priorities. Absolutely. To your exact point, we are the wealthiest nation in the world. It's a matter of lacking political will to bail out working people. That's all it is. It's not a matter of a deficit and debt or any other issue. It's a matter of not caring to bail out working people and have our political system be dictated by corporations, the top 1%, with their massive lobbying efforts and financing of political candidates to do their bidding at the expense of working people. That is at the core. Corruption and money in our political system is at the core of why we see all the money diverted towards things like weapons manufacturers, because that maximizes their profits and it pays dividends to their shareholders at the expense of people here at home who are suffering without a roof over their heads or food on the table or healthcare coverage for their family.
So one of the other issues that you deal with, and it was kind of interesting in the way you dealt with it, was the question of climate change and transition, but you put it in the context and connected it to transition into Medicare for all, which I found unique. I know that plenty of progressive candidates have positions on climate change and transition, obviously decarbonizing the economy, and also on healthcare, but you kind of connected the two. And I just want to read the heading. You call for providing a federal jobs and wages guarantee and tuition-free college for workers in the fossil fuel and health insurance industries as we transition to a 100% renewable energy economy and implement Medicare for all. So I thought that was kind of unique that you really connected those two and saw those two as one whole pie, if I can use that term.
Well, it's a labor rights issue as well, right? And we have to recognize that within the renewable energy sector, there's a lot more work needs to be done on collective bargaining and unionization rights.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we have to recognize that our climate chaos is inherently a public health issue that is disproportionately impacting communities of color. Here in our communities in Los Angeles, we have over 1,000 abandoned oil wells that are predominantly located in Black and Latinx neighborhoods that are seeping out formaldehyde and other kinds of noxious chemicals into the air that increase high rates of asthma, lower educational attainment, increased rates of cancer. So it's inherently a healthcare issue. So we have to be intersectional in the approach.
And I wondered, as we wrap up our conversation here, when you talk about Congress needing to establish a federal jobs guarantee for workers in the fossil fuel industry, this is a really critical issue. And here's why it's somewhat controversial, if I can say. Environmentalists and people who are arguing for active engagement in climate change now, in decarbonizing the economy, I don't think they understand, and they don't fully talk about the real dollars that it would require to transition workers. If you take, for example, a coal miner in West Virginia, a unionized coal miner, they are making a pretty decent wage. And when we say federal jobs guarantee, which you're arguing for, my question always has been, and it's the question on the minds of millions of fossil fuel workers, what is that job going to earn me? So are you, when you say federal jobs guarantee, are you saying that it's going to be a one-to-one reality, that whatever you're making is as a coal miner now, you will make in that federal job?
Well, it's a federal jobs and wages guarantee, right? Recognizing that as we immediately make this transition to 100% renewable energy economy by 2030, as scientists have demanded that we do, we need to ensure a just transition for all of our workers. And for some of those workers, transitioning from coal mining, from fracking, or from other sectors of the fossil fuel industry into renewables, some folks will want to make that exact transition. Others may want to go into something else. And so by also ensuring that we have tuition-free college, it provides an opportunity for those workers to be able to go into other disciplines if they want. But having that wages guarantee ensures that as they make that transition, they're not losing their living wages, they're not losing their income, and kind of figure things out with the assistance of the federal government. Because to your point, it's a massive change, but it's a necessary change.
So your position is that someone who loses their job because of decarbonization won't suffer a loss in their income, whatever job they end up in.
That's the goal. And it's not about losing their job, right? It's about transitioning folks to a renewable energy economy. We don't have to see it as a zero-sum game where someone's losing their job now. It's making that transition, and the federal government can absolutely facilitate that to ensure that we're not losing any workers through the cracks. And that's why having a strong labor approach is what's so essential with both Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. As we abolish private insurance, as we abolish the fossil fuel industry, we need to make sure all those workers are protected.
I know you're saying that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but I'm telling you that millions of workers see it that way. And if you want to have a conversation with unionized workers, coal miners, and other folks, you can't use this theoretical language. You have to say to them, and I just want to make sure that this is your position, as you move into a new job, however long it takes, you are not going to lose the income that you're making. Is that right?
Correct. You are not losing your income. No.
Okay.
And that's what a just transition is ensuring that you have the living wage that you were already making or better as you transition either into renewables or go into a completely different sector for yourself.
And I would just tell you that too many environmentalists don't have that position. They talk about good jobs and they talk about green energy jobs, but they actually don't confront the reality that most of those jobs are in non-union sectors. They're not unionized, and they pay a whole lot less than a union salary in, say, a coal mine. So
that's why we need unionization to be strengthened within the renewable energy sector. That's why I mentioned that.
Let me wrap up with this question. I want you to be personal, not policy wonk and ideological. What has it been like running for office? What are the pluses and minuses as a first-time candidate? Be real personal about this.
It's been just inspiring speaking with community members and hearing their voices about what matters to them, and This is absolutely the hardest thing we'll ever do, but it's a necessary thing to do because people are hurting. And, I wake up every single day, and when I meet with our community members, talk to them about what's going on in their everyday lives, what's going on in their kids' lives, how their jobs working for them, what's their healthcare coverage look like right now? Are they worried about putting their kids back in school under COVID-19? If they're teachers or at school administrators, do they have access to the vaccine to go back to a safe working place? Having those conversations are what keeps me going, because we're building that community together and talking about the issues that matter to them. And that's what keeps growing our movement organically, is creating a community dedicated to fighting for the structural reforms that matter.
And I've been a candidate myself, so I'm going to be very blunt. A lot of this sucks. And I'm going to give an example. I'm sure you don't have a great love for sitting on the phone hour after hour trying to fundraise. So I'm sure someone like you, a community person, that's been a big challenge, having to try to raise money, especially to compete against someone who's getting huge gobs of corporate money. So what's that like when you have to phone for dollars?
Honestly, it can be grueling after a while, but that's part of the conversation, right? I can't say I've had one, and I'm very lucky to say this, I haven't had a single bad conversation. Yes, there have been conversations where we have a lot of differences of opinion, but we're meeting each other where we're at, and we're just having honest conversations about what we care about. And that still builds our community. We can do that over the phone or in person. And so, yes, it's grueling. It's many, many long hours. It's the hardest thing I've ever done and will do, but it's necessary. Our community deserves it.
Well, good luck to you, and good for you for jumping into the race. And thank you for spending some time with us. And we'll have you back on the show sometime down the road to update the audience on your progress. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
That'll do it for this week's broadcast. Thanks to my guest, Shervin Azami. Our editor is David Hebden. Of course, consider being a sponsor. Go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there, and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up and become a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter. You can also do that over at ActBlue. Look for Working Life with Jonathan Tasini, and there you can also become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. And of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel and the newsletter over at Substack. It helps us spread the word and build an audience. Thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.